In the first chapter of Red Dead Redemption 2, Rockstar immediately made the game's historical connections clear, from the Colorado-inspired state of Ambarino and its mining town of Colter, down to the canned food in the Adler Ranch and the slurs that Micah uses. But in Chapter 2, now that we're out of the snow, the world is opening up, and before long we'll get to see the livestock town of Valentine and all of its many historical connections. So let's take a look at the real history of Red Dead Redemption 2. Before we get going anywhere, Hosea gives us a coffee. I think you know where this is going. Knowledge of coffee drinking and coffee trees dates back to the late 15th century, but they were first brought to the Americas when they arrived in the Caribbean in 1720. It didn't truly become the drink of choice until after the Boston Tea Party in 1773, however, as Americans decided that tea, largely associated with the British, had become unpatriotic. There are several interesting things inside Arthur's sleeping quarters, but perhaps my favourite is the flower in the glass jar. At first glance, it seems most similar in appearance to an Echeveria plant, though those are only native to Mexico and Central and South America, several of which were actually formerly classed in the Echeveria genus. In Chapter 4, Arthur tells Mary Beth that the flower is native to the western United States, around California and Oregon. Two Dudleya plants closely fit this description. Dudleya cymosa, native to the rocky areas in low elevation in California and southern Oregon mountains, and Dudleya farinosa, which is native to Oregon and northern California. Elsewhere in Arthur's quarters is a newspaper clipping from his first bank robbery in 1887, which bears a striking resemblance to a New York Times newspaper story from 1863. In the game, a brazen bank robbery, in real life a bold bank robbery, involved three men robbing the bank of Lee and Hoyt, in real life Waters Bishop & Co. In both instances, the robbers scored about $5,000, but while in the game the men escaped and were reported to have used money to help orphans and the poor, in real life all of the robbers were eventually captured. Over in Dutch's sleeping quarters, we can find a few books, several of which appear to have real-life inspirations. Existence and Oblivion by Nikolai Fedorov is not a real book, but Nikolai Fyodorovich Fyodorov was a real Russian Orthodox Christian philosopher. An American Eden is written by Evelyn Miller, who bears a striking resemblance to Henry David Thoreau. Both men were interested in education. Miller lectured at Princeton University, while Thoreau opened the Concord Academy with his brother. And both were clearly interested in fighting against the bigoted hold of the country's leadership. Miller, as we'll see later in the game, attempts to help the Native Americans against the government, while Thoreau, disgusted by slavery and war, famously wrote the essay Resistance to Civil Government. I'm jumping a bit ahead now, but even their later lives were quite similar, with Miller resigning from his position to move to a cabin in the woods, and Thoreau experimenting in simple living by moving to a small house in a forest. Elsewhere in the camp, you'll find a game of dominoes, which has a much more recent history than one might expect. The oldest confirmed written mention of the game comes from 13th century China, but the modern game of domino didn't surface in Europe until the early 18th century, and it doesn't seem to appear in American literature until the 1860s. By 1889, however, the game had spread worldwide, so the Van der Linde gang's enjoyment of it is unsurprising. Within the camp, the Van der Linde gang keeps some chickens around, presumably for eggs. Chickens arrived in the New World in 1493 as a passenger on Christopher Columbus's second voyage to the Americas, so they're nothing new, but by the end of the 19th century, they were becoming rarer as many people began moving towards industrial cities. To eat chicken, especially chicken salad, around this time was a symbol of wealth, as the rarity of chicken in cities meant that only the rich could afford to eat it. In the chapter's first mission, Arthur kicks Uncle awake, and they decide to head into town with some of the women. Before long, they start to sing a song.
I got a girl in Berryville, can't be screwed 'cause she's too damn ill, so I don't go down there no more. The blue horse lays outside her door.
They sing 4 verses in total, and they're all based on real-life verses that were heard or retold around Arkansas and Missouri in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. They're all pretty much identical, besides some minor censoring, an occasional word change, and of course the complete replacement of the first 2 lines of the second verse, changing the location from Baltimore to Valentine. Speaking of Valentine, it doesn't take us too long to arrive, and it certainly doesn't take long for the women to mention the sheep, or their smell, because of course Valentine is a livestock town. Cattle towns, Midwestern settlements catering to the cattle industry, were fairly common in the 19th century. The first to be established was Abilene, Kansas, which became a market for Texan cattle in 1867. Dissatisfaction with the Kansas Pacific Railroad, however, led several Texan cattle drivers towards Nebraska in the 1870s, and eventually towards Cheyenne, Wyoming. Cheyenne became the center of the cattle trade in Wyoming, which was unusual for cattle towns at the time, as it was also a center of society and culture. Its diverse economy allowed it to prosper through the off-season. Its proximity to the Colorado state border and relative closeness to the Rocky Mountains also make Cheyenne a pretty good candidate for the inspiration behind Valentine. As the group make their way down the main street of Valentine, Uncle tells Arthur that he can start making money by completing bounties for the local sheriff's office. This system was implemented due to failures brought on by a lack of finances and public faith in the criminal justice system. The reward system allowed bounty hunters to push beyond the financial and physical restraints of law enforcement officials. However, there were some drawbacks. Whenever a law enforcement officer wanted to offer a reward, they were required to contact the Attorney General in Washington, D.C. for approval. Generally, they waited for a reply before offering a reward, which could often cause delays in capturing the criminals in a timely manner. On their way through town, the group ride past two saloons. Of course, saloons feel like the quintessential image of the American frontier, and the first one, Brown Saloon, opened in 1822 near the border of Wyoming, Colorado, and Utah, serving mostly fur trappers at the Browns' Hole trading fort. Before long, saloons became especially popular with soldiers, cowboys, and miners, and poker tables were present at virtually every one. When Arthur eventually stops the wagon, the women tell him that they'll get to work.
We'll start at the saloon.
This is especially interesting because typically women weren't allowed at the saloon, so it's unlikely that the women simply walked into the saloon looking to buy a drink. They more than likely started acting like dance hall girls or prostitutes. Dance hall or saloon girls were tasked with brightening the evenings of the men, singing for them, dancing with them, talking to them, anything to get them to remain in the bar and continue buying drinks. Based on where Karen ends up though, it's more likely that she pretended to be a prostitute. As the women get to work, Uncle takes Arthur into the general store. General stores existed in the United States as early as the 18th century, but they became increasingly important in the 19th as the country grew and railroad lines were built. They generally grew with the times too, offering a range of services: banking, shoe fitting, postage, pharmacy, school supplies, gun and whiskey sales, and so on. General stores became especially important after the Civil War, so it should come as no surprise that there's basically one in every town in Red Dead Redemption 2. Inside the general store, Arthur can select items to purchase on the shelves or in a catalogue on the store counter. The in-game catalogues appear to be based on the Sears, Roebuck & Co. catalogues of the 1890s and early 1900s. Rockstar has made some adaptations to fit with the in-game items in the user interface, but the designs are undoubtedly influenced by the real catalogues. One major difference, however, is that the Sears catalogues were primarily used for mail orders, while those in-game are essentially treated as a product directory for the stores. If you stick around the store long enough, you'll notice Uncle buying a jaw harp. Interestingly, these were originally known as a Jew's harp, and this is still a term often used for them today, though the exact origin and reasoning behind the name is unknown. The name jaw harp first appeared around the late 18th and early 19th century, roughly 100 years before Uncle buys one here. Once their shopping trip is over, and after a quick nap, Arthur tracks down Karen in the hotel across the street. Places of accommodation date back to biblical times, but the widespread constructions of hotels was facilitated by the Industrial Revolution of the 1760s. One especially prominent early hotel was Tremont House in Boston, Massachusetts, the first hotel to have indoor plumbing, toilets and baths, a reception area, and locked rooms for guests, among other innovations. At the end of the mission, if Arthur spares Jimmy Brooks, he is rewarded with a steel pen. Based on the appearance, this looks to be a fountain pen. Metal nibs for pens, typically made of copper and bronze, date back as far as ancient Egypt. However, the quality of writing was inferior to that of reed pens, and until the 18th century, they were really only made as one-off luxury items. In 1809, Peregrine Williamson was the first recorded maker of steel pens as a primary occupation in the United States, sold for $1 each, the equivalent of $21 today. They began to take off in the decades that followed, with mass manufacturing beginning in the early to mid-1800s. At the beginning of the next mission, it's interesting to note that there are women at the saloon, but as mentioned before, these are likely working girls, probably prostitutes, whose presence is expected. The same, however, cannot be said about black men, Native Americans, or Mexicans, 3 ethnic groups in which Charles and Javier can be classified. Now, Native Americans were excluded from saloons by law, and black men were only occasionally accepted begrudgingly, or at least ignored if he was a noted gambler or outlaw. Charles is neither. Meanwhile, it's unlikely that a Mexican would have been totally ignored at this time, especially with some of the racial tensions between the United States and Mexico at the turn of the century. Bill certainly wasn't the reason Charles and Javier were allowed into the saloon. Perhaps Valentine is a more progressive town than I thought. One of the women at the bar calls Arthur a
toughest teak mountain man.
Interestingly, real mountain men would have been located relatively close by, though likely many years earlier. From 1810 to the 1880s, and especially around the 1840s, mountain men were explorers who lived in the wilderness, most commonly around the Rocky Mountains. They were instrumental in the opening of several trails in the country, which were eventually widened into wagon roads that allowed Eastern Americans to settle into the far west. They arose in the first place due to the lucrative earnings available in the fur trade, but the failing fur industry around the late 1840s led to their eventual decline. Of course, Arthur isn't actually a mountain man in the traditional or historical sense, but he sure resembles the stereotypical image of one. Before long, the boys find themselves involved in a bar fight. These occurred around this time, of course, but the media loves to romanticize their frequency. In truth, fights happen everywhere, but the presence of alcohol likely played a part in the locations of bars. During the early 19th century, especially around 1830, Americans consumed almost 3 times as much alcohol as they do today. This number dropped as the century went on, especially before Prohibition in the 20th century. Probably a good thing too, considering how hard Arthur beat Tommy. Interestingly, 3 words or phrases mentioned towards the end of the mission seem to have originated in the decades before Red Dead Redemption 2.
Come here, you little greaser.
Greaser dates back to at least the 1840s, a popular insult for Mexicans at the time, as it apparently referred to how people of darker complexions were said to have oilier or greasier skin. Some also think that it refers to the greasing of wagon axles, a lowly occupation typically held by Mexicans.
Ya bum! Ugh.
The word bum in this context is meant to refer to a homeless person or a vagrant. It was first used in this way around the 1860s, apparently taken from the German word Bummler, which means loafer, somebody who is idle or unemployed.
Huh? Come on, pretty boy. Pretty boy? You're kidding me. Pretty boy?
Pretty boy, at least in this place, time, and context, is meant as an insult, referring to a man who is particularly interested in his clothing and personal appearance. Not that there's anything wrong with that, of course, but Arthur is meant to be a rough and tough cowboy who doesn't have any feelings, so it's pretty offensive to him. The term is known to have been used as early as 1835, so it's no surprise that Tommy has added it to his own vocabulary. Before long, Arthur and some gang members set out to rescue Sean. Trelawney finds out that Sean is being transported towards a federal prison. In 1891, the Three Prisons Act authorized the operation of the first 3 federal penitentiaries in the United States. Technically, however, none of these began operating as federal prisons until at least 1902, though this can likely be attributed to a simple mistake by Trelawney, who was more than likely referring to a state prison. After they rescue Sean, the gang decide to throw a party to celebrate his return. Over the course of the night, you'll hear several different songs performed by different members of the gang, and all based on real folk songs of the time. The first, named by Uncle as the Louisville Maid, is based on a folk song called the Amsterdam Maid. This written version, the one used by Rockstar as a reference, was sung in 1933 by a man from Missouri, who recalled learning it around 1890. The lyrics are basically identical. The next song, lovingly known as the Ring Dang Do, is much more well known. Likely originating in the United States and sometimes known as London Town, the song is said to have been continually learned by new generations, particularly 12 or 13-year-old boys. Due to the widespread nature of the song, it's difficult to track its exact origins or its original lyrics. The version in the game is an amalgamation of different versions, with verses dating from the 1940s back to the 1920s, and appearing pretty severely edited for the game. It's possible that some of the in-game verses may not have actually existed in 1899, but the song's history is so convoluted that it's likely that it existed long before it was ever written down. Even if the game is inaccurate here, it's only been a few decades at most, and who would complain about hearing Uncle sing this?
And that's what you call the ring-dang-doo.
The next song is called Jack o' Diamonds, but this wasn't always the case. It has its earliest origins as far back as the 17th century as a Scottish folk song Way Up on Clinch Mountain, though the lyrics are significantly different. Another version of the song appears in print in 1874, this time known as The Rebel Prisoner, with, again, very different lyrics. It's also known by the name Rye Whiskey, perhaps most famously in a song by country singer Tex Ritter in the 1930s. The version from the game, however, appears to be based on one printed in 1910. The lyrics remain mostly the same for the most part, but towards the end it starts to swap several verses around, though this is completely unsurprising considering Sean's state at the time of his performance.
To enter her door.
The last song is a solo performance by a very drunk Sean.
Oh!
Known as the Sprig of Shillelagh, this is a traditional Irish song, appearing in print as early as 1825. The original song is 4 verses of 8 lines each. Sean sings most, deciding to skip 2 of the final ones to skip right to the end of the song. I understand, he probably needs to get some rest. The lyrics are pretty much identical though, which is doubly impressive considering his drunken state.
With his sprig of shillelagh and shamrock so green.
One of the next few missions is for Reverend Swanson. The name of the mission, Who is Not Without Sin, is from the Gospel of John in the New Testament. In the New International Version, it's from John 8:7. Let any one of you who is without sin be the first to throw a stone at her. This chapter isn't the only one that Rockstar took inspiration from. John 8:32 states, "Then you will know the truth, and the truth will set you free." A familiar line for fans of the first Red Dead Redemption. The location of this mission, Flatneck Station, has a few historical artifacts of interest. We already know about the history of water towers, but just above that is a windmill. The placement of these so close to each other would make this appear to be a wind pump, a type of windmill used for pumping water. Early versions of wind pumps were first introduced in the Middle East around the 9th century, eventually making their way to Europe and eventually to the United States and Mexico, in harsh environments where water was only found deep underground. In 1854, Daniel Halliday designed the self-regulating windmill, turning automatically and only requiring maintenance as little as once per year. This invention was crucial to the operation of steam trains, allowing further autonomy and development. Inside the main building at Flatneck Station, you can find a wooden pallet on its side. An early alternative form of pallet, known as a skid, can be traced as far back as ancient Egypt in the 1st millennium BCE. Much later, they were used to move goods in American factories in the late 19th century. However, skids aren't the same as modern pallets. They lack the bottom deck boards that secure them when lifting with a forklift. Now, the forklift wasn't invented until the 20th century, and the development of the wooden pallet didn't appear to start until the 1920s, becoming much more popular during the Second World War in the late 1930s. So why the workers at Flatneck Station have one in their possession some 30 years before its invention and 40 years before its popularization is beyond me. At the beginning of the mission, Swanson tells Arthur,
I have removed myself from Morpheus's embrace.
This appears to be an adapted version of the more common expression, in the arms of Morpheus. The Greeks believed Morpheus to be the god of dreams, so to be in his arms is to be asleep, or in a state of unawareness or being forgotten. By apparently removing himself from such an embrace, Swanson is attempting to snap back to reality, to return to the land of the living, though it appears the alcohol may be preventing him somewhat. When Arthur finds Swanson, he is playing a game of poker. Of course, poker is basically synonymous with the Old West. During the American Civil War in the early 1860s, poker was played by both sides during the large stretches of downtime between fights. The soldiers who survived the war took the game home with them, and its popularity grew, eventually making the game synonymous with the expansion of the Western frontier in the late 19th century. It's no surprise then that the game can be played so frequently throughout Red Dead Redemption 2. The name of one of the next missions is also based on an old text, though not quite as old. Exit Pursued by a Bruised Ego is based on an infamous stage direction from William Shakespeare, Exit Pursued by a Bear. The direction appears in Act 3 of The Winter's Tale, and its random nature has led to significant confusion about the staging of the scene. The name is also a hint towards the animal that we see much later in the mission. Speaking of which, Hosea tells Arthur that he has seen a bear.
One of the biggest I ever saw. I reckon nearly 1,000 pounds.
My God.
The Kodiak bear actually commonly reaches sizes of 1,320 pounds, with some as heavy as 1,500. That's 680 kilograms. But these are native to the Kodiak Archipelago, a group of islands south of Alaska, so it's unlikely that this is what Hosea saw. The only native bears in the Rocky Mountains region, the area that most closely resembles Amberino and the grizzlies, are grizzly and black bears. The legendary bear that Hosea and Arthur look for is a male grizzly, which are typically between 400 and 800 pounds, but there are reports of some reaching as much as 1,000. In the late 19th century, one grizzly bear in captivity was apparently fed so much by the thousands of visitors that he could not walk, only moving by crawling. He was estimated between 1,800 and 2,200 pounds, but after his death he weighed a little under 1,200 pounds. Before they head out, Hosea tells Arthur to move his saddle to a different horse. Now, some evidence suggests that saddles have been used since around 700 BCE, and they were fairly common during the Middle Ages. When the Moors invaded Spain in 711 AD, they brought with them a distinctive saddle. The Spanish adapted the basic design to create the Spanish war saddle. As a Spanish transitioned from military conquest to colonial expansion, the saddle evolved, and of course, as they colonized the Americas, the saddle made its way there too. Mexican vaqueros, early cattle handlers and horse trainers in the US and Mexico, developed a saddle for working cattle across vast lands, and thus, with some modifications, the Western saddle was born. In preparation for the bear hunt, Arthur crafts some bait out of fish and berries. This is pretty accurate for a bear's diet. Grizzly bears are big fans of fish and eat lots of berries, especially around September and October in preparation for hibernation in the winter months. In another mission, Bill threatens Kieran with a pair of gelding tongs. Now, the name of this tool is interesting. A gelding is a castrated animal, usually a male horse, while tongs, of course, are a type of tool used to grip and lift objects. What Bill appears to be using, however, is an emasculator, a tool used in livestock castration. It works by simultaneously crushing and cutting the spermatic cord, preventing hemorrhaging while still detaching the testes. While the intended use of the tool is accurate, its portrayal is not quite. The act of castrating a horse is more complicated than simply cutting off the testicles and cauterizing the wound. Kieran, having a good knowledge of horses, should know this. Perhaps that's why he's even more scared, because he knows the correct way to do it and knows that Bill might not be so precise. Or maybe he's just scared of Bill holding a hot metal tool. That makes sense. As the group ride off towards the O'Driscoll's camp, Bill tells Arthur that he's put some throwing knives in his saddlebag. Throwing knives may date back to ancient Libya around 1350 BCE, but they can confidently be traced to Central Sudan around 1000 AD. In the United States, they were popularized in the late 19th century by traveling acts like the Barnum and Bailey Circus. Interestingly, despite their portrayal in video games and films, they're unlikely to be 100% effective in combat, unless perhaps as a ranged stealth attack as they used in this mission. They're more likely to be used as a distraction technique, focusing the target's attention away while the attacker readies something a little more useful, like a gun. Inside the cabin at the O'Driscoll camp, Arthur can find a bottle of Kentucky bourbon. As the name suggests, bourbon is strongly associated with the state of Kentucky, its suspected place of origin. The term bourbon began to appear in newspaper advertisements for Kentucky by the 1820s, but its origin story from Bourbon County, Kentucky, didn't appear in print until the 1870s. It's suspected that the drink may have actually derived from Bourbon Street in New Orleans, where it was popular in the French Quarter saloons. Regardless, its placement within an O'Driscoll camp, and eventually in Arthur's satchel, is entirely unsurprising. Elsewhere in the cabin, Arthur can find some snake oil. Chinese water snake oil was used around the 1840s by Chinese railway labourers who worked long days of physical toil on the Transcontinental Railroad. The oil is suspected to have had real benefits due to its high concentration of the omega-3 fatty acid EPA, more than salmon. Later in the 19th century, rattlesnake oil was promoted as a similar cure-all. However, genuine rattlesnake oil is not known to have any health benefits. Despite this, some people took it a step further, substituting the rattlesnake oil for something even cheaper, thereby misleading the customers. Clark Stanley's snake oil liniment was taken to court over its ingredients. He was found guilty and fined $20, equivalent to $430 today. As a result of these deceptions, snake oil has become a euphemism for healthcare fraud or scams, something that fans of the first game may be familiar with. Above the chimney in the cabin, Arthur finds a double-barreled shotgun, which he cleans. This was and is a common activity done by any diligent gun owner, especially if the gun is exposed to harsh elements. Plain soap and water, preferably hot water, was the cheapest cleanser, and sperm oil was the best. Even a temporary dab of olive oil, castor oil, animal fat, or wagon wheel grease was better than nothing. Nothing but the best pocket oiler for Arthur though, which very closely resembles its real 19th century equivalent. Another mission in this chapter is given to Arthur by Leopold Strauss, the gang's loan shark. In the late 19th century, banks and other major financial institutions stayed away from small-time lending as they were viewed as irresponsible and unprofitable due to the low legal interest rates. Instead, plenty of small lenders offered loans at profitable but illegally high interest rates, presenting themselves as legitimate. By the 1890s, usury, now known as loan sharking, had become a large cottage industry throughout the United States, especially in the West. Around the time, loan sharking was viewed as one of the country's two greatest social evils, alongside alcohol consumption. To force a defaulter into paying, the lender would often threaten legal action or public shaming. In the 1920s and 30s, a new breed of illegal lender was finally beginning to be noticed, one that used violence to enforce debts. Sound familiar? One of the defaulters from which Arthur must reclaim the debt is a man named Roble, said to be from Silesia. Silesia is a historical area that was contested between Poland and Prussia for centuries. Roble is from the Polish region of Upper Silesia. After World War II, most of Silesia was transferred to Polish jurisdiction. A small part remained in Germany, and an even smaller part in Czechoslovakia, now the Czech Republic. Within Roble's home, Arthur can find and take a wedding ring. Interestingly, men didn't frequently wear wedding bands at this time. It wasn't until around the 1920s when the industry began paying attention to the groom. In 1926, manufacturers and jewelers launched a major campaign to popularize the custom of male engagement or betrothal rings. That's not to say that it didn't happen beforehand, of course. In World War II, many men would wear wedding rings as a reminder of their wives and families. So perhaps Roble kept his, in a drawer notably, not on his hand, to remind him of a wife back in Silesia, or passed away. In one of the game's most iconic missions, Arthur and Lenny get drunk at the Valentine Saloon. Before they finish their first drink though, there are a few terms of interest. Lenny describes Micah's state on their trip to Strawberry.
He was half soaked before we even got there.
Soaked, of course, is a synonym for drunk, one of many actually, thought to have been first used in this context in 1737. At the bar, a local man tries to insult Arthur and Lenny.
Oh, there, dullards!
This word, meaning a stupid person, a dunce, a simpleton, originated in the mid-15th century. In this mission, yet again, we've got Lenny, an African-American man, happily drinking at the bar. In this instance, however, he is preceded by Arthur, who has a bit of a reputation in Valentine, and is therefore unlikely to receive much opposition, so Lenny's acceptance makes a little more historical sense. At the end of the mission, if Arthur gets caught and arrested with Lenny, the deputy offers them a way out.
It's $10 and you're free to walk.
Sure.
While he claims that this is a fine for drunken violence, this may not actually be the case. In the 19th century, there was a growing belief, in the United States especially, that prison sentences and probation should focus on rehabilitation instead of punishment, so they became the primary type of sentence instead of criminal fines. That's not to say that they were completely removed though. Now, according to the Judiciary Act of 1789, bail, money paid to secure the release of a prisoner, can be decided upon by any judge, used in all non-capital crimes. In medieval England, which is what the American system is loosely based on, local sheriffs could dictate the conditions under which a defendant could be detained. However, this system was abandoned in the 13th century, long before the United States was colonized, so it's unlikely that the depiction in the game is bail, at least legally. Unless the deputy was really telling the truth and it is a $10 fine for drunken violence, which is certainly possible in a small cattle town like Valentine, then it's more than likely that this transaction was an undetected bribe. Unsurprising, really. Every town and city in Red Dead Redemption 2 is pretty historically and culturally significant, and Valentine is certainly no exception. Its historical connections, from its general inspiration from cattle towns down to the specific history of its general store and saloon, demonstrate Rockstar's care and attention for its open worlds. But we're not out of Valentine just yet. We've still got quite a few missions left in the game's second chapter, including another train robbery that might just have the most interesting historical connections so far.